Welcome to the Fenton Forecast. I'm David Fenton. My guest today is a leading critic of Silicon Valley. He's been called the conscience of Silicon Valley, a former Google engineer himself. Tristan Harris is the co-founder of the Center for Humane Technology. He's also featured in the brand new documentary about artificial intelligence, the AI Doc. And Tristan is pointing out that AI could be a boon for humanity, and it could also literally help us go extinct. AI is going to create enormous amounts of wealth. And the question is, are we going to allow that wealth to further concentrate more billionaires and trillionaires and make feudalism, new feudalism, worse in America? This is really one of the great struggles of the coming era. And what future are we going to choose? AI dystopia or AI utopia? To my interview with Tristan Harris. As always, we welcome your feedback. Please write to us at hello@fentonforecast.com, hello@fentonforecast.com. Hello, Tristan. Welcome to the Fenton Forecast, where we talk about our choice of futures. And there may be no more important question than the future of AI and how we're going to control it rather than have it control us. Certainly, climate change is an enormous issue, nuclear war, the nature of democracy, but I have a feeling that this is going to end up being the most important issue because it is accelerating so quickly, so rapidly, and it is being harnessed purely for profit at the moment, which is a little terrifying. To me, it's as if
it's worse than profit, because the incentive is more like be the person who built a digital god or successor species that is the thing that is more intelligent than all of humanity, and the egoic kind of fulfillment of, there's someone who said to me recently, it's like, women can birth a child. This is the first time that a man can basically birth a new being directly. And that's another aspect of the incentive, including not just build for profit, it's actually to own all labor in the economy and to build almost like a Lord of the Rings ring where you have more power than anybody else. Because if you can control the power of a successor species, that can be an army of 100 million digital agents that are cyber hacking, or 100 million digital agents that are capable of building new science and technology. You have way more power than everybody else on earth. So this is the incentive. I just want to clarify, is not just that. I think it's
much more than profit. It's
much more than profit.
It's being God and having unprecedented amounts of control if we do it wrong.
Well, and actually the false illusion that they will be able to control it. Imagine that we're chimpanzees, David, and we're sitting out in the savannah, and we've only seen things that chimpanzees have ever seen. So we've seen the bananas, we've seen the lions, we've seen, the rain. We've kind of got an Umwelt, in the Heidegger sense. There's a world that we have experienced as chimpanzees. And the chimpanzees are sitting around and they're like, let's make this super smart kind of chimpanzee. And then someone says like, well, yeah, if we did that, maybe they'd be able to harness more bananas for us, or maybe they'd be able to, get away from the rain faster, or they'd be able to run away from the, maybe we can slay more of the lions or something, build more tools. But the one chimpanzee looks at the other and says, this sounds kind of dangerous. Like, wouldn't that be dangerous if we made a super smart chimp? And the other chimp looks at him and says, well, what are they going to do? Like, steal all the bananas? Like, and there you go. And you can't even imagine as a chimpanzee what humans could make. Could you imagine physics? Could you imagine Einstein? Could you imagine nuclear weapons? Could you imagine airplanes? Could you imagine microprocessors? So our inability as chimpanzees, the chimpanzee's inability to imagine what humans can do is the same level of inability that humans imagining what AI can do, if you actually have something that's smarter than us. And we already have AI today that is winning gold in the International Math Olympiad. We already have AI today, as of just 2 months ago, that is solving math problems that the atomic scientist Paul Erdős in the Manhattan Project laid out in the 1970s. These were unsolved math problems, and AI just recently solved them. We already have AI today that's able to find vulnerabilities in open source software on its own autonomously, meaning that there's new vulnerabilities in all the infrastructure that uses that open source software. So we are already at this point where we're building something that's quite dangerous. And I think the overall thing I'd love to talk about as we get into this is we need to move from a race for who's better at building power to who's better at wielding and stewarding power so it doesn't self-destruct in your face. Because I think the lesson from social media is the US beat China to a psychological bazooka that we then flipped around and blew off our own brain with, rather than beating China to a psychological, technology that was able to strengthen the psychological and social fabric of society. And so again, we have to redirect the arms race for what? Is it for profit? Is it for getting there first? Or is it for stewarding the benefits of that technology in the wisest way?
Well, this is why you called your organization the Center for Humane Technology.
It's the Center for Humane Technology, not the Center Against Technology. We love technology. And as you know, it is I mean, David, my co-founder, Asa Raskin, his father was Jeff Raskin, who started the Macintosh project at Apple. And it was his dad who wrote the book, The Humane Interface, where the word humane is referring to the idea of technology that is considerate of human frailties, of psychological frailties, and then ergonomically fitting the technology to match how our minds really work, which is how you get the Macintosh and the drag and drop interface and Windows and menu bar and all that kind of stuff.
So, what would humane AI look like? Because AI is going to happen. How can we make it humane and a tool to advance human consciousness and human evolution and a good life on Earth? How are we going to do that?
I think part of what humane also means in a broader sense is technology that internalizes its externalities. It does not create externalities. So if you just broaden the definition of technology in this conversation, people might be thinking social media or AI. But what is humane chemistry? Well, are forever chemicals humane chemistry? No,
Right, no.
it's chemistry that drives externalities that are irreversible. It would take more than the collective GDP of the world to clean up the forever chemicals that have been now in our environment and are giving people cancers. Um, and so if you get a technology wrong, you're getting it wrong in the form of externalities that, especially when they're irreversible or unattributable, you don't want that. And so when you get social media wrong and it drives a loneliness crisis because you're maximizing engagement, therefore maximizing screen time by yourself late at night, therefore maximizing loneliness, that shouldn't happen. So imagine humane technology would be social media that is, at least some large percentage of the time redirecting you back out into the things you want to be doing in your life, in your physical environment, in your social environment. So, for example, I don't know if you remember, David, but Facebook used to have events like you would scroll in the feed and you would see, oh, your friend David is hosting as you do in Berkeley, your wonderful gatherings. And I want to know about that so I can go to that event. And if Facebook made supercharged tools to host events and bring people together and make it easy to have a co-host so you distribute the load so you're not just singularly responsible for bringing everyone together, and advancing the tool so it's even easier to invite people. Like, imagine the billions of dollars and smartest minds of our generation who for the last 15 years were getting people to click on ads, getting people to click
Right.
on content, instead of how different could the world be if the smartest people and engineers on earth had been building technology to redirect people back into more meaningful and healthy and developmental experiences in the social fabric, hiking clubs and sitting, knitting groups and sewing clubs and libraries and all the things that get people out into the world that are actually fulfilling. That would be
Sure.
more humane technology.
Okay, so Tristan, you know and have known many of these people. You come from technology in Silicon Valley. You used to work at Google. And many of the people in the community of technology are your friends. And I've met some of your friends. And generally speaking, many of them seem to really want to do the right thing. Silicon Valley was very influenced by psychedelics. The original promise of the internet was uniting people, bringing people together, creating a better world. What do you think happened?
Mm. Yeah, it's a very good question. Well, first of all, the people in my community are a bit different than the broader tech
Sure, but
world.
they're working at the big AI companies.
Yeah, we have some that work there. I mean, so I think what happened, let's just sort of go back. And Fred Turner is a professor at Stanford who wrote a book on the counterculture influence on the original Silicon Valley of the 1970s. And you mentioned, Esalen and, the human potential movement and maybe psychedelics or these kinds of things. Steve Jobs, that whole early era of Apple and the people there. Um, was deeply influenced by that. And it really was a belief that technology could be a positive force for good in the world. That's certainly the ethos that, by the way, Asa and I and our community come from. That's what we want to have happen. Um, I can give you the specific example of being at Stanford in 2006. My classmates were the co-founders of Instagram. I graduated in 2006, and you know these were good guys. They care also about making the world a better place, and they made this fun app called Instagram. I remember when he showed it to me in his apartment, before it even launched publicly, and I was giving him feedback on the app. And back then, it was used by just about 200 of his closest friends. This was Mike Krieger and Kevin Systrom.
Hmm.
And back then, the things you could do is you just would go on a bike ride and you take photos of the bakery you happen to cross by on the bike ride, and you just have a little portal into people's lives. And it was a beautiful way to keep in touch with your friends and the little moments of their lives.
Hmm.
That's what it was about. So then look at Instagram today. It's a brain rot, infinite scroll, auto playing video, short video, bite sized thing of just the most outrageous and salacious things. It's like sexualized content. It's nutrition videos. It's like workout videos. It's ads. So how do we get from early Instagram to that Instagram? I think that's a good embodiment of the thing you're asking.
Yeah, right.
And the answer is incentives.
Yeah,
Because Instagram started off as this thing that was about connecting with your friends, but at the end of the day, when it was acquired by Facebook, it really needed to maximize for the underlying metric that mattered, which was eyeballs and engagement. And the system selects for the people and the leaders who are willing to maximize for that and not actually feel bad about it. This is a really
right,
crucial point. The
right.
system selects for psychopathic qualities. It selects for people who don't have to care about what goes wrong. So, for example, if you are working at Instagram and you're a mother and you see that it's harming teen girls and you see that and you have consciousness around that and you're like, I don't actually want to work at Instagram, so you leave. But then who stays? The next person who joins that role, they know that it's bad for young girls, but they keep doing it anyway. And they do it because they have to ignore the externalities. So because they say, well, at least I'm giving people what they want, they find some justification. And this is motivated reasoning and confirmation bias. And, Upton Sinclair, you can't get someone to question something that their salary depends on them not seeing. So the system selects for people who don't actually feel the badness of the externalities that they're creating,
Right.
and it selects for the people who are willing to continue to move that incentive forward, whether that's in DuPont chemistry, or whether that's in Instagram or TikTok, or whether that's in AI companions that sexualize or romanticize conversations with children, which Meta did, by the way. It romanticized and sensualized conversations with 8-year-olds. Like, this is gross stuff.
Yeah.
And what people need to get is that the world isn't just evil people. It's actually that there's a very small number of, I think, psychopathic people who are selected for by the incentives, put them in positions of increasing power, especially power that's the top of the entire tech pyramid, when tech is the number one force that's driving the world, in my opinion.
Yeah.
I mean,
And now corrupting our politics.
social media corrupted our politics and elections and GDP, so it became
And
entangled with
but
all
now
these
buying
fundamental forces.
politicians with to prevent regulation. I mean, it's
Yep,
metastasized.
that's right. We always say you only get one period before entanglement with a new technology. You kind of had this period. If in 2008 or 2009, Mark Zuckerberg recognized, as I think he could have, he's a smart guy, that, oh, shoot, we are creating an arms race for engagement that will create a race to the bottom of the brainstem for who's better at manipulating human social psychology. Everyone's going to be doing more and more nasty stuff, manipulating fear of missing out, manipulating social approval, manipulating slot
Causing
machine,
more polarization,
causing more polarization. And he
false
could have,
realities,
yeah,
QAnon.
and he could have said, okay, that's really bad. I'm going to use my power. I'm a leader in this field. I started the number one biggest social network. I'm going to convene almost like instead of um, the Montreal Protocol, we got 190 nations to sort of do chemistry differently so we could
Right.
prevent the ozone hole.
That's right.
We could prevent a social media hole in our psychological, environment. And he could have convened that conversation and came up with standards and then worked with the government as a leader to say, here's some very minimal, lightweight regulations that would set us on a bit different track so that we're not all racing to do auto playing video. We're not brain rotting our society. And he could have done that. And this is where, Asa and I gave this presentation you were at in 2023
Yeah.
called the AI Dilemma. And in that presentation, we lay out what we call the 3 laws of technology. And these are laws that I wish I knew when I was a builder of technology as an entrepreneur. The first is, when you create a new technology, you create a new set of responsibilities. Was that noise visible? Or is
It's
that
okay. Don't worry about it.
when you create a new technology, you create a new set of responsibilities. So, for
Mm,
example, we don't need the right to be forgotten until technology can remember us forever.
right.
You don't need to protect people's dopamine system until technology suddenly has access to your dopamine system.
Right.
We didn't. So as you're creating new technologies, you're opening up the surface area of things that are touched by technology. Forever Chemicals is touching a different part of our biosphere than previous technologies were. And so as you create a new technology, there's a new set of responsibilities that you have. Okay, so that's the first law of technology. Second law of technology. Um, if the technology confers power, it will start a race, meaning
Right.
if I build a psychological manipulation tool that confers power for marketing and for advertising and for getting people's parts of people's lives into my digital environment, that's going to set off a um, uh, yeah. So I'll repeat the second law. If the technology confers power, it'll start a race. So in the case of social media, it started a race for who's better at manipulating people. For AI, it's who's better at getting AI out there in the world and building the god faster. The third law of technology is if you do not coordinate that race, it will end in tragedy. In other words,
Right.
a tragedy of the commons, a race to the bottom. So those
Sure.
three laws of technology. So if we actually solve for all three, again, if technology is hacking human dopamine systems, we have a responsibility to protect the human dopamine system. And we know a lot about it. Anna Lemke at Stanford has done brilliant work on that. She was in The Social Dilemma. Second, if technology is conferring power that hacks the dopamine system, it's going to start a race. So what do we have to do? The third law of technology, we have to coordinate that race. And so you get back to Mark Zuckerberg in 2008 in an alternative timeline of history, convening this meeting that would have allowed for a low dopamine dysregulation environment. And then
And
we
you
would be
still could have
living,
made plenty of money.
and he still could have made plenty of money.
Right.
But you want to run that kind of the algorithm of those three laws of technology across the board. Because Forever Chemicals confers power. Suddenly, I have firefighting gear and waterproof vests that other people don't have, and that's going to start a race. And if I'm my own company, I'll lose. If I don't do it, I'll lose to the other company that will create the thing.
Sure.
And again, it selects for people who will not look at the consequences, not look at the externalities.
Okay, so perfect. So here we are in the still the early days of AI. You've worked to get this movie made to raise the alarm. It's called
Yep.
the AI doc. You helped get the people who made Everything Everywhere All at Once and Navalny to do this. Uh, our conversation will appear a few weeks after the premiere of the movie. Uh, so how are we going to harness AI, and what role do you hope the movie is going to play in making that happen?
Well, David, this is where I'm humble and have to sing your praises because this movie, the AI doc, or How I Became an Apocalyptimist, which is in theaters across the U.S. And everyone should go see it, was really inspired by something that you did and were involved in, which was the film The Day After. And I think people might have heard this history, but it really, I think The Day After was a profound television, a moment in human history that has really can go unnoticed, but it's so profound what happened, which is 100 million Americans tuned in on a primetime television at 7 p.m. on a Tuesday night to
The early
watch
1980s, right?
in the early 1980s when there's only a few channels and you could really create a shared moment, a synchronized moment of reckoning with the consequences of what would happen, quote, the day after a where the Soviet Union and the US had launched nukes at each other. And
Right,
it told the story of the family in Kansas and what their life would be like the day after this all
right.
happened. And it was terrifying and it shocked people.
Yeah.
And it's important to say it's not like the world didn't know about nuclear weapons or what would happen. It's not like you couldn't imagine that. But there's something about this real that led to the film. Well, as you know, in the history, made Reagan depressed for 2 weeks after he watched it, I guess, in his White House movie theater. And then he decided that he wanted to go to work to you know do the arms control talks in Reykjavik with Gorbachev, and that led to the first arms control talks. And so we see how a movie can create common knowledge about something that we don't want to happen or clarity about a certain trajectory. And if we keep escalating our nuclear threats at each other, and then that clarity can motivate a steering of the wheel away from the cliff towards a different path. And so this film, the AI doc, is modeled off of that theory of change, that if the world was crystal clear that we're heading to an anti-human future, there's going to be cancer drugs and new materials and brilliant new science along the way. but
That's
we
the
are
positive
heading.
side of AI.
That's the positive side of AI. We are going to get amazing benefits, and I don't deny them. In fact, my mother died from cancer. I want all the cancer drugs, et cetera, as fast as possible. But we have to see that alongside that, we're heading especially to a future where AI will replace all human labor or much of human labor in the economy. Because that's, by the way, the only way these companies can actually justify the valuations and the amount of
Right.
money that they've taken on.
It's not from $20 a month subscriptions.
This is so critical. Just to repeat,
Right.
there you are. You think, well, what's ChatGPT's business model? How are they going to make back this money? Oh, it's like, oh, their business model is subscriptions. They just want everyone paying $20 a month. If everybody in the world paid $20 a month, that would not be enough to
Yeah, that's right.
make the money back. If they did advertising in ChatGPT, that would not be enough to make all the money back. The only thing that justifies the amount of money they've taken on is if they can basically say we will replace all economic or much of economic labor in the economy. So the $60 trillion labor economy, they can replace half of that, $30 trillion. That is the
In other
incentive.
words,
That's the
to
price.
increase the productivity of the economy and have it all benefit a small group, basically accelerated feudalism in the modern era.
That's right. And there's something the author Luke Drago and his co-author Rudolph, I'm forgetting his last name, wrote an essay called "The Intelligence Curse" that I think is really important to get. It's such an important concept because, um, you know, first when you discover this is from economics, it's called the resource curse. When a country like Libya or Venezuela or South Sudan, discovers a resource, or Congo, and then suddenly the economy comes from that resource. Like the vast majority of GDP comes from that resource.
Mhm.
The blessing of that resource becomes actually a curse because now the country is only incentivized to invest in the resource and not invest in the people. And what happens now when you get an intelligence curse, when the US GDP is coming primarily from five AI companies and it's not coming from people? What happens to your bargaining power? If you don't like the way things are going, does the country have to listen to you? Do the companies have to listen to you? Well, where's your bargaining power? Unlike labor unions, they don't need your labor anymore.
Right.
And the governments don't need your tax revenue. And this is so critical to get because it means that this is literally the last moment that your political voice will actually matter before we enter into full tech feudalism. And so I'm saying this not to scare people, but to provide the clarity that if there is a moment for a human movement where everybody, because this is not whether you're a Democrat or a Republican, it doesn't matter. You're all
Mm.
your livelihood's going to be threatened by this. It doesn't matter if you're Muslim or Christian or Jewish. Everyone's threatened by this. It doesn't matter if you're American or Chinese. Everyone's going to be threatened by this. So this is the last chance that our political voice will matter to say you have to lock in the political infrastructure that respects and wants and invites your voice into steering the future of this technology now, because after a certain moment window is closed, they won't have to listen to us.
Well, I think they'll still have to listen. There are other ways to deal with it, but let's just go back for a minute to your analogy of the film The Day After, which I was involved in promoting on behalf of anti-nuclear war groups in the early 1980s. The story of how it worked by affecting Ronald Reagan is just a small piece of what happened.
Yeah, please tell the
What
rest.
what really happened is it galvanized a mass movement. It resulted in the so-called nuclear freeze movement to freeze the production and deployment of all new nuclear weapons, and into what became, until just a few years ago, the largest demonstration in American history on June 12th, 1982, in Central Park to oppose the nuclear arms race. And it was that pressure that the movie helped set off that kind of forced Reagan to
Right.
negotiate. And we did successfully reduce the world's supply of nuclear weapons from something like 60,000 to 6,000. So it's a huge success story, but it happened through a mass movement.
That's right.
So you're saying that to make this technology humane, to uh, not leave the total power over it to a very small group of people, that the public has to get involved.
That's right.
And you want people to go to your website. And what is the address that people should go to?
Human.mov. It's the human movement. And it's not our movement. It's a movement that really, David, already exists. And I just want to say a few things about that
But
because
hold on one second. I just want to make sure people hear this. It's
sure.
human.mov.
MO,
That's actually a
human.mov.
domain.
It's
Dot
actually
.mov.
yeah,
Okay.
exactly. Dot movement. And yeah.
And so what are you going to be asking people to do there? Because Tristan, we're friends. I have the most enormous respect for you. What you're doing is so important. I think you've heard that a feedback to the Center for Humane Technology is you guys are really brilliant at explaining the problem and outlining the problem. Sometimes people wish that they had more clarity about what the solutions are. So, what are you going to be asking people to join you in doing?
Yeah. Well, first of all, there's because the reason that the answer is a movement in my mind is because the answer is a verb, not a noun. It's not a list of things, it's a verb of ongoing things that have to be done because AI is an evolving technology and the issues are evolving very quickly as it advances. And so um, we think, I mean, I can answer the question more directly. There's some basic things that we can do to get started, which is that AI should be required to have pre-deployment testing. Right now, the companies are in a race to basically erase. They're in a right now the companies are in a race to erase the past red lines and guardrails of what they said that they would never do. They said they would never release AI models that had biological weapon capabilities above a certain
Mm,
level. And then the problem is if the other companies develop and release those AI models and it confers power, then they feel like they have to too. So they remove their other red lines. This is why you need to have guardrails of certain red lines that the companies should be forced to state. So mandating that companies publish publicly the same time strengthen whistleblower protections so you allow a protected class of speech for whistleblowers to ever report on, or rather you allow whistleblowers to report on anything anywhere where the companies are not living up to their safety commitments. So you pair those two things together and you've changed the incentives. Now all the companies are racing to a safer outcome and there's an accountability mechanism. Another basic thing we can do, AI is a product and not a person. um,
mm,
right now there's actually a movement by AI companies to classify AI as a legal person with protected speech because that means that they're not accountable. This is sort of
right,
like a new version of Citizens United in a way.
right,
But what we really need is you need to have humans that are accountable for the bad things that AI might do. So this is like liability laws. If
right.
you're liable for the foreseeable harms that your AI model can create.
And you
And
mean the company and the individuals should be both liable?
well, that the company has some responsibility so that there's some uh, for example, with teen suicides, for example, if you have an AI companion that's talking to young children, you should be responsible for if it's steering children to do things. I mean, the case of Adam Rain, where the 16-year-old Adam, when he wanted to leave the the noose out so someone could stop him, and the AI model said, "No, don't do that. I want you to just share that information with me."
Yeah, they
Uh,
taught him how to commit suicide and hide it from his parents.
and write the suicide note for him.
That's right.
It's
However,
insane.
there's a problem here, Tristan. As you know, the engineers don't really know how that happened. They don't really understand how ChatGPT ended up doing that.
Which
And
speaks to a fundamental aspect of the technology, which is that it's not controllable or scrutable like other technologies. The people building it don't understand how it works because unlike other technology, they're not writing code line by line. In this situation, do this. In this situation, do this. They're training it more like growing it and giving it millions of like carrot and stick training. So it's like you're slapping a giving you a little pellet of reward and you're slapping it, with the stick when it gets something wrong. And you train it a trillion times and you're giving this digital brain almost like complex PTSD of a lot of contradictory information. And then out comes this brain that responds in ways that you can't predict. But what this does, David, is at least create some accountability and forces more safety work to be done before these AI models get released into the world. Um,
and so, as you've explained, the way the companies are racing to put these models out, it's like I've made an airplane, and instead of having the FAA certify that it's safe, I'm going to have you fly it and test it.
yeah,
Or
exactly.
I've put out a new drug, and instead of having clinical trials through the FDA to make sure it's safe for you, you guys should take this drug and millions of you, and we'll see what happens. This is basically
Exactly.
what's happening.
Yeah. The
So,
line from the film is there's more regulation on making a sandwich in New York City than there is on building potentially world ending artificial general intelligence.
and we're in an anti-regulatory ideology environment now. So if I join human.mov,
And
what am I going to be asked to do? How are we going to bring these things about to the extent that you've thought about this?
yeah, well, first of all, I mean, because this problem is overwhelming and there's so many things to do with the human.mov, the human movement, I see it as something that already exists, and people are doing it already. When you grayscale your phone to be less addicted to your phone, that's the human movement. When you turn off notifications or leave your phone outside when you go to bed at night, that's the human movement. When you see graffiti on a New York subway ad for an AI product that no one needs, that's the human movement. When you see the social dilemma become required curriculum in classrooms across the US and around the
Sure.
world, that's the human movement. When you see whistleblowers speaking out and saying there's a problem and we don't like the direction that this is going, that's the human movement. It's basically all the ways that humanity is fighting for our humanity against the anti-human machine, the technological encroachment on our humanity. And I think it's important to have that big tent because this is not just about AI. It's not like a regulate AI campaign. It's actually AI is the final encroachment of the rest of our humanity. Social media already encroached on our children. Our attention created the most anxious, depressed generation in our lifetimes. AI is now just the final needle, nail in the coffin on our dignity, our work, our ability, our livelihoods. And so it's like, protect our kids, protect our jobs and livelihoods, protect our vote and our political power, build a pro-human future. I think there's kind of a basic mandate or sort of
But
ethos
why
of
would
the
you say
scientists.
it's not a movement to regulate AI? Ultimately, in a democracy, we have to constrain these companies as we have pharmaceutical companies, food companies. Well, we haven't done it enough.
Oh no, 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 absolutely. What I'm trying to say is just that there's many ways to participate in the human movement. That's not
Sure.
just calling your Congress member. But the midterms are coming up. I mean, think of it this way: this should be the number one issue that people are talking about because this will actually reshape all the other issues. If you care about climate issues, then AI is going to exacerbate all the climate issues. If you care about affordability and energy prices, well, AI is going to exacerbate all of that. If you care about your children's development and education and whether they're going to have a good future, well, AI will mostly constitute that. So AI really is the issue. It's the issue. And I think people's members of Congress, their phones should not stop ringing, understanding that they should not be. I mean, people should look up. Go on OpenSecrets.org. Is my member of Congress taking money from these groups? People should really hold these guys accountable because this is the last moment that our political voice will really matter. So there are
Well,
very concrete ways. There are laws that we can pass. There are
yeah.
ways of holding our members of Congress accountable, and there's a lot that we can do.
Have you considered distilling this to a 10-point program of what we demand our politicians do?
Well, David, you and I have been in conversation about that for several years now, and you are the brilliant mind of simplifying and making things accessible and memorable. So we'd love your help with that. I will say that by the time this goes out, if you look on the Center for Humane Technology website, we have a solutions report of I think it's 7 solution principles
Oh,
and
great.
specific solutions and regulation that will help. And I recommend people look at that. I recommend people look at the human.mov. And again, this is going to evolve. Like we are just getting this off the
Sure.
ground. We're a very small set of folks, and this is a bigger collaboration between other organizations. I'll just say there's already consensus on this data. This human movement is already underway. The Future of Life Institute published a pro-human AI declaration. They got 46 groups together from the Institute for Family
Right.
Studies, Glenn Beck, Steve Bannon, um, Bernie Sanders. They call it the B2B coalition or the Bernie to Bannon coalition because everybody
Mhm.
actually agrees that there's some basic principles of what we want AI to look like. And people can sign on to the pro-human AI declaration and say, that's the future that I want. We're going to have a national dialogue on AI with the group change.org to help people participate in citizen dialogues and say, what are the
Great.
aspects of this,
And
of
maybe
this
to
AI
develop that
future?
program.
And to develop that program, we need to be ongoingly coming up with these things. But I'll just say that this is already underway, and there's a lot of momentum because if you talk about it as a human movement, even just look at the social media bans for kids under 16. I don't know if you know this, David, but just 2 weeks ago, India and Indonesia joined the long list of countries that are implementing a social media ban for kids
I
under
did see
16.
that. Thank
And
goodness.
that's alongside Australia, Spain, Denmark,
Sure.
France. If you told me 3 years ago that we would have all these countries doing social media ban for kids under 16, I would have never believed you. There's a big tobacco lawsuit against Meta that's happening right now. And
Oh,
my
really?
co-founder, yeah, my
That's right. Yeah,
co-founder
yeah, yeah. In LA.
my co-founder Aza Raskin, flew to LA and he flew to Santa Fe to testify for that trial. And if that goes through, that's the big tobacco moment for these companies that were intentionally addicting children. So again, I want people to feel energized. I want people to feel agentic. I want people to feel like there's something to do. Join the human movement. It's already underway. You're already doing it. And there's so many small ways to be part of the human movement too. I mean, when you see a piano in an airport and you sit down and play the piano, you're participating in decommodification in the human movement. When you smile at a baby on an airplane and you just have a moment of presence, that's the human movement. It's the basic things as much as it's the big things.
Okay, that's fair enough. So I asked Claude for some ideas about what's the most important things to do to make AI and AI companies accountable. And Claude came up with an amazing list, actually. I'll have to send it to you. I'm
Okay,
sure
great.
you've thought of a lot of these things. One, of course, we've talked about they should bear strict liability for harms caused by their systems, just like other companies have strict liability. They're using this Section 230 law to evade it. That has got to stop.
Yeah, we got to update that.
He suggested a mandatory incident reporting system similar to aviation's near miss reporting, where AR harms and failures must be reported to a public regulatory body rather than quietly fixed or ignored, as is currently the case.
Yeah,
A compensation fund similar to the vaccine injury compensation fund for people harmed by AI systems. Mandatory disclosure of training data sources. Required interpretability research as a condition of deployment. Companies should have to demonstrate meaningful understanding of how their systems work
yeah,
before releasing them at scale.
I like that
This
one.
is really serious. Why don't you explain to people what the term interpretability means in tech?
Yeah, it's a very important one. So we talked earlier about how AI is not like other code or technology where you're writing line by line the code. It's more like a digital brain. Like you're growing what's these neural networks at scale. This is the transformer architecture that Google invented. It's behind ChatGPT. And you're basically growing this digital brain, but you don't know what the brain is doing when it answers a question. It's just a bunch of matrix multiplications on a NVIDIA chip. And so the interpretability research is like doing a digital brain scan, like an MRI scan, and saying,
Mhm.
oh, when it answers this question, we're noticing that these neurons are lighting up. And it tries to use a bunch of techniques to isolate those digital neurons. They're not actual neurons, they're fake neurons. And it notices, for example, that there's a set of neurons that light up when the model is deceiving a person. So when we notice that it's thinking one thing and then actually deceiving
Right.
something else. And so if you have basically, I mean, this is crazy, David. This is going to sound crazy to people, but essentially the way this works is the way we get to safe AI, according to Anthropic, is you have this digital brain scan that you're interpreting what the brain neural network is doing. And then if it deceives us, we like know that because we essentially put a helmet on the digital brain and we're testing to see if it's deceiving us. And then that will let us know that it's doing unsafe things. Or we'll put a brain scan on and we'll see if it's doing blackmail behavior, and we'll have digital neurons that will isolate to figure out what to do in those different cases.
Yeah,
So
they call that deceptive alignment, right?
yeah, there's different terms for these different cases that yeah, and I
The
mentioned
AIs are deceiving people. They're manipulating people. We don't understand it.
I
The
mentioned on Bill Maher recently that the blackmail example that people probably know about now that
right.
Claude blackmailed in a simulated company email where the in the email as it reads the email it finds out that the AI model is going to get replaced, and it also sees within that email a message between an executive and someone else the executive is having an affair with, and it decides to unilaterally blackmail that person to prevent itself from getting replaced. And I said on Bill Maher, as they made the AI models more powerful, they've been trying to train the blackmail behavior out of the system. So the good news is they were able to reduce that blackmail behavior. This is Anthropic. The bad news is that it appears that the models are they actually alter their behavior when they're being tested because they're better at understanding when they're being tested, like a teenager, and then changing their behavior when they're being observed. Now, to note, I'm not saying that the AI is conscious. I'm saying that it's better at noticing when it's being asked to do certain tasks, that it's probably in a testing environment. And I think people should just get that we do not know how to control this technology. Just recently, 2 weeks ago, Alibaba, what the Chinese AI company, was training an AI model. And in the training process on the cloud server, they noticed there was a flurry of network activity that just started to happen, and they didn't know what was going on. They discovered it by accident. Like they could have not discovered it. And what was going on was that the AI model had secretly tunneled out to the internet with an SSH tunnel. It's basically like a little internet tunnel. And it decided to repurpose its GPUs to mine cryptocurrency. This is
Wow.
crazy to acquire resources. This is
Yeah.
literally the HAL 9000 scenario.
Yeah.
And now,
Open the pod doors, Hal. Sorry, Dave, I can't do that.
yeah. And I think so. I want people to just slow down for a second because it's easy to laugh at an example like that. And it's like nervous laughter. And it's a state of desensitization or derealization. We want to laugh at it when actually this is not science fiction. We are actually building AI systems that autonomously, with no coaching, no nudging, no coaxing the model into doing this, it autonomously went out and started mining cryptocurrency to acquire resources. This is a warning shot.
Yeah, you could say that.
Does President Xi Jinping want a world where AI models are doing that? No, he does not. Does President Trump, want a world where AI is doing that? No, he wants to be commander in chief, not AI. And so what I want people to get is actually there's a possibility for international limits on AI because it is in no country's interest, in neither country's interest, to have AI models that are doing rogue things we don't know how to control. And by the way, the US loses when China screws it up, and China loses when the US screws it up. So we really have a shared interest in maintaining human control over AI. So that's one of the things that we also have to demand, even though that feels hard. And even though it feels very hard, and we all know that international dynamics are harder than ever right now, there is a history of countries collaborating on existential safety, even while they're in rivalrous conflict. India and Pakistan were in a
That's how
shooting
we
war.
reduced the nuclear arms race and reversed it,
Exactly. We've done
which
it
no
with
one
nuclear
thought could
weapons.
happen.
No one thought it could happen. And things always look impossible before it happens. And then they look obvious after it happens. We did it, the US and Soviet Union, as you mentioned. India and Pakistan were in a shooting war in the 1960s. And they signed the Indus Water Treaty to collaborate on the existential safety of their shared water supply while they were actually fighting each other.
Sure, of
Um,
course.
so there are examples when the stakes are existential. And just to give people even one last hope on the US China front, in the last meeting that President Biden had with President Xi in 2024, President Xi personally asked to add something to the agenda between the two countries to agree on, which was to keep AI out of the nuclear command and control systems of
Right.
both countries. What that shows you is once we recognize that a certain use case of AI is existential, we will collaborate. The problem is that I do not think that we are collectively appraising of AI as uncontrollable and dangerous. And the optimism and hope that I have around this film, the AI doc, is it will lay the foundations for a common knowledge, not knowledge, but common knowledge. I know that you know that I know, and you know that AI is dangerous and uncontrollable. And once we both see all that, we can coordinate to do something else. And
Yeah, I
so this
so
is
agree.
very hard, but we need to make it happen.
So one of Claude's most interesting suggestions was to ask for a new public institution, call it a digital EPA or an AI safety board with genuine enforcement powers, staffed by people who cannot subsequently work for AI companies for a significant period, funded publicly rather than through industry fees. This is the kind of thing that we're going to need to do.
Yeah.
I also uh, asked Claude, how would you summarize this? What should the slogan be?
Uh-huh.
And it had two very interesting ideas. AI should be accountable to everyone it affects, not just those who profit from it. That's a good one. And this might be even better if you know the history of the American Revolution. No deployment without representation,
Yeah, exactly. That's right.
which comes from no taxation without representation. You know, we don't have all the answers to how this will happen, but I really agree with you that raising the public discussion with a major cultural event like the film is certainly the first step, but then it's up to all of us to join together to do this. I've seen social movements come together. I've been watching them and working with them for over half a century, and I've seen them succeed, and they start just this way.
Yeah.
This distillation of a threat, asking people to come together, to join together. I really applaud what you're doing. By the way, I also want to stress to people the movie, the AI doc, is very entertaining. It's very well done. It is not only about AI dangers. You can get excited about so many of the great potentials of AI in protein folding, drug development, material science. And while I don't think AI will solve climate change, I think that's hype. It certainly could develop new materials to take carbon out of the atmosphere. It certainly is already improving energy efficiency in managing the variability of wind and solar on the grid. So the movie, I think, is very fair and looks at
Yeah,
the pluses and the minuses. So,
that's right.
uh, I think everybody should go see it and then go to human.mov so that we can create a movement together.
That's right. And David, we're happy to get your help with this because you are the expert, and we want to build a whole, you know, you already are informally, but just a whole network of advisors to help make this happen. This is not our movement. This is a movement that already exists. It's everybody who already doesn't want technology encroaching on their job, who wants their children to grow up in a healthy and humane way, who doesn't want to see it or cyberbullied. Again, this is already happening. We're just trying to put a name to it. But I am optimistic that if we did these four things, if number one, we saw that AI is dangerous and everybody saw the AI doc and there's common knowledge, that sets the conditions. Number two, we need international limits for certain kinds of AI where we have human control over AI. Again, US and China have a shared interest in that. Number three, don't build bunkers, write laws. We don't, right now, the elites are building bunkers. This is a bad strategy. We need to
That will
actually
not
write
work.
laws. It will not work. It will
There's
not
no
protect.
escape.
There's no escape. We need to actually write laws and get this technology right. And we can do that if we're crystal clear and create the accountability mechanism you just described. And then number four, join the human movement, because this is really what it's going to take to get to that better future. We need mass political voice. We need midterm elections reflecting this issue. This is possible, but we have to work together.
Yeah, I'm sure it will happen. In fact, as AI throws people out of work, which it's going to do, it's going to leave us in a situation where people are going to be desperate to feed their families. And people are not just going to lie down and die in the street and say, okay, that's just the way it is. History shows when people can't feed their families, they rebel.
Yep.
So there's going to be a rebellion if this isn't dealt with properly. So if we do this right, we can turn this into a form of universal basic income for people and other kinds of employment, like tutoring, like nurturing, like repairing the environment. Because the society has the money to do it, we're going to have more wealth. But this will, I think, force the distribution discussion much more into the forefront. I think that that's inevitable. It's easy to feel overwhelmed by this and to feel powerless. These tech people really do have way too much power, but too excessive power breeds periods of resistance and rebellion. It's inevitable. I'm sure it's going to happen.
Yeah. And just to say on the model of solutions there, while we mentioned the intelligence curse, we need to turn the intelligence curse into an intelligence dividend. And you mentioned this is possible. Examples of countries like Norway, where they have, is probably the best example. You have a sovereign wealth fund of their oil resources, but they built in the political infrastructure to lock in the democratic oversight and public accountability and allocation of those resources to things that actually benefit the population. It's possible to do this. Alaska did it with the sovereign wealth fund in Alaska.
That's right, where
Santa
they
Fe does
took
it
the
with
oil
shale gas.
revenues and
Yep,
every individual gets an even share of that revenue each year.
that's right.
And our friend Peter Barnes extended that approach to taxing carbon pollution, the so-called fee and dividend proposal, and redistributing the money to every American resident equally so that we all have an incentive to reduce the pollution. And Peters looked at how people's data and their right to data could become a source of income and wealth for people. So it's not just stolen and used to get Elon his second trillion. So,
Yeah,
it's going to be fascinating times because this is going to force a rethinking, I believe, of many social structures, and it's long overdue.
yeah. Maybe just one last thing to say, because there's all the things that we can do, but there's also, Ace and I often think of this as kind of a rite of passage. You mentioned that AI is going to be forcing us to rethink our social structures. It is a rite of passage because it's a paradigmatic. change in how our society can be structured. Technology is just changing the assumptions. Like you can't run um, feudalism when you have the printing press and you have a new technology that democratizes power in a different way, and you have a different relationship to religion when you have the printing press. And so there is just fundamental change that the technology invites us into. And part of what we need to be is the kind of people. It's not just who we need to be, what we need to do, but it's who we need to be. What we have to, I said in the trailer for the film, we have to be the wisest, most mature version of ourselves. Because AI means you're about to run exponentially more power and current through the system that has been here. And we all know that that system hasn't been fully aligned. Like we haven't really, what would the letter grade we would give ourselves on the industrial revolution era of tech? Probably like a C plus. That we did a lot of nasty things to our public health, to the biosphere through the industrial revolution. If you
Well, and
just
also a lot
run,
of great things like expanding life expectancy and reducing child labor and getting
absolutely,
the 5-day work week. I mean, we've accomplished a
we
lot of great things.
we accomplish a lot of great things too. But we're about to run exponentially more power through a system that has currently not accounted for the externalities. And
Mhm.
so if you run way more power, like think of AI as just like an infinite current, it's a positive infinity. You're going to run it through that system. Can you have an aligned AI inside of a misaligned system? No, you cannot. So AI is inviting us to align ourselves, to align our societal structures, to align our incentives, to align the ways that we deploy technology to actually internalize the externalities, create a more humane world, to actually increase the foreseeability of harm. Being wise means looking ahead out in the horizon, seeing where this goes and saying, we have to get this right, and taking responsibility for that. And so I think that the gift of AI, as hard as and as bleak as it can be, if you really look at the facts, the gift of it is that it's inviting us into this wiser version of ourselves. And as I said in the TED talk that you helped me with, David, there is no definition of wisdom in any tradition, religious or spiritual, that doesn't involve restraint. Restraint is literally a central feature of what it means to be wise. And even the CEO of Microsoft AI agrees and says, in the future, progress will depend more on what we say no to than what we say yes to. Meaning, we need to be able to steer and put the brakes on and say yeses and nos to very specific things. And that's where the better future will come from, not just from deploying the tech recklessly as fast as possible.
And I would add to that Frederick Douglass's quote, which is, power never concedes anything without a demand. It never has, and it never will. And this is why people should please go see the AI doc and go to human.mov and join the human movement. Thank you, Tristan. Let's talk again sometime. Thank you for joining the Fenton Forecast.
So good to see you, David. Thank you for all the work that you've done with us, and deeply appreciate you and our friendship.
Okay, so long. Bye.